Welcome, y'all. My name is Carrie Staten. I am the director of WVU Tab. We're excited to chat with you today. The rest of we have a larger team and growing all the time, but with us today we have KDC, who you'll hear from in just a little bit. Becca Phillips, who is our cruise director for the day. We'll make sure everything goes smoothly on a technology basis. And Seth Cardwell, who put together these beautiful slides and is on his way to a project meeting. So that is our team. So what is WVU Tab? WVU Tab stands for Technical Assistance to Brownfields. We are the technical assistance provider for EPA Region 3. We're funded by EPA directly to provide technical assistance to West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and DC communities and stakeholders. We can help anyone who's doing anything related to brownfields. We provide a number of different resources that we like to target and tailor to your specific needs, although we do have sort of a menu of services that you can get an idea of. And one of the things that we do is educate folks throughout the region on brownfields more broadly, which is what we're here to do today. Another key part of our provision of services is helping to identify resources and funding to get those projects done. So we do things like assisting with understanding the EPA grant writing process, reviewing grants, both for EPA grants, but also more broadly, any grant that's related to your brownfield work. And we will soon be launching an opportunity for very detailed resource roadmaps for selected projects. And then we also can support your broader brownfield work at the local level, things like developing a brownfield inventory, answering any one-off questions you have about sites, or doing consultations about your project throughout the process, as well as broader technical support, understanding environmental reports and things like that. Next. What is a brownfield? A brownfield is defined by the US EPA as a piece of real property, the expansion or redevelopment of which might be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. What does that mean? This is just a property that is sitting either completely unused or underutilized, is not being used to its full potential because there is a concern that it may be contaminated. You don't have to know that it is contaminated. If you do know that it's contaminated, that's fine too. But you might just suspect that it has. Maybe you heard from through the rumor mill, or you lived in town your whole life and you know it used to be a gas station. But that all makes it a brownfield. There's not a formal certification process. If you think it's a brownfield, it is a brownfield. Just a quick background on how we got to the term brownfield. So in 1980, Congress passed what's known colloquially as CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Compensation and Liabilities Act. This created the EPA Superfund program. That program was in response to some major environmental disasters, including Love Canal in New York, where there was some active property contamination that was migrating to nearby properties, including schools and residential areas, and people were getting very sick. So there was a clear uptick in things like cancer incidents in that neighborhood, and it was clear that it could be connected to the contaminants at the Superfund program. But at the time, there was really no way to compensate those people, to relocate them or for their medical expenses, and also to clean up that site. And so the EPA Superfund regulations were born to regulate those sites when that happens, when there is that extensive contamination. One of the differences between Superfund and brownfields is that there is a certification process. You are on a list to be a Superfund, or you are not. You can get onto the list, you can get off of the list after some cleanup, but there is a set list of Superfunds. So in 1990, the U.S. Conference of Mayors identified brownfields as a critical problem facing cities. So what happened in that CERCLA legislation is that there was no distinction between any kind of environmental contamination. So sites that were environmentally contaminated, what we now call brownfields, but were not posing an immediate threat to properties around them, were not differentiated. There also was no consideration of risk-based cleanup. So polluters were expected to clean up or pay for cleanup of their properties or properties that they had contaminated back to pristine levels. And what was discovered is that, number one, what is pristine? Do we know what it was like at that factory in 1895 before they built it? We don't know the status of the soil then. And B, that last bit of cleaning up the contamination was the most expensive part and probably the least impact from a public health and environmental concern perspective. And so in 2002, as a response to some of that and some of the legal decisions that had been made, the way it was written was causing banks not to want to lend on properties like that. So it was really stymieing the redevelopment of these sites. And so essentially, property owners were just fencing them up, and they remained blighted in those communities instead of an opportunity. And so in 2002, Congress passed the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfield Revitalization Act, which created the Brownfield program. It recognized some of the work that was happening in states, created the pathway for states to have memorandums of agreement with EPA related to brownfield regulation, and helped to overcome some of those issues that had come from the circular legislation. And then in 2018, the BUILD Act, or Brownfields Utilization, Investment, and Local Development Act, was passed. This was a reauthorization of the Brownfields legislation and also did some amendments both to Brownfields and CERCLA. Next. So where are they? As I said, if you think it's a brownfield, it is. So they're everywhere. Some common examples are gas stations. We've all seen closed gas stations, those tanks that are underground, any kind of gasoline. I mean, we've all spilled a little bit on the pad when we're pumping our gas. Anything like that is a brownfield. A laundromat, especially dry cleaners, but also larger, just traditional laundromats. Abandoned mine lands, which we have a lot of in Region 3. Abandoned schools or commercial buildings, which are everywhere. Also factories, any number of things. Next. So why do you need a brownfield makeover? So in addition to just being these kind of gross looking properties that we saw in the last slide, they also present some other negatives and threats to a community. So there may be health hazards, either from groundwater contamination that then does impact other properties. There may be health hazards if anybody's accessing the site, if it's not properly secured. There is the primary issue of environmental degradation because the soil and the groundwater may be contaminated. There may be safety liabilities. Oftentimes, brownfields there's not only contamination in the soil, but there's a derelict building or a dilapidated building that could cause a safety issue if someone's in it when they shouldn't be. They also tend to attract crime both at the site but in a broader neighborhood, because it indicates that there's not a lot of attention paid to that neighborhood, and so a big abandoned building can be appealing if you want to hide. It does decrease the property values not only of the site itself, but from the sites around it, and then that continues to have economic ripple effects. So obviously an abandoned factory that's completely empty, maybe half of it's burned out, it's falling in on itself, is not contributing to the local economy, it's not contributing to the local tax base. But if it were turned into pretty much anything else, it would be contributing to the economy in some way. Even if it were turned back into green space, it would at least be increasing those property values around it. It would provide a public good that would ultimately increase the value and the quality of life of folks in that neighborhood and community. What are the benefits? So the flip side of the negatives, what are the benefits of a brownfield makeover? As I said, it increased the property values of that site as well as the sites around it. It makes your community prettier by eliminating eyesores. It enhances your economic and tax-based development. So both from the broader market and your local economy, as well as better resources for your public entities as that ripple effect that we talked about happens. It takes something that is currently a liability and turns it instead into an asset. A lot of times in communities, there may not be a lot of available property, especially property that is suitable for development. And so brownfields provide an opportunity if you can deal with the environmental or even just deal with the hesitation and the concerns that folks have about the environmental aspects. It becomes a real opportunity as opposed to a liability. It connects economic growth with environmental growth with our benefits, which we're big fans of around here. In the best of times, creates new and local jobs, and again, supports sustainable land use. So anytime you're reusing a brownfield site to put another industry or another commercial use or housing, you're not using green space. You're not destroying land that is currently available for environmental benefits, for public recreation benefits, that sort of thing. And I think that's the end of me for now.
For
I'll be
now.
back later.
Thanks, Carrie. All right, so she gave you a bit of background, and so the next question becomes, how do I make over a brownfield? And so we like to point out that you have opportunities to be creative. We just have included some examples of former brownfield sites that you've no doubt driven by. I know I was in Columbus this weekend and saw quite a few. Here's a library in Shepherdstown. It was on a former landfill site. They can turn into parks and green space, residential or mixed use space, and then also you can see a downtown commercial area. So a lot of great ways that you can integrate former dilapidated sites into great benefits for your community. When it comes to starting on this process, you need to establish your team. And there are a lot of people that you could identify for the team. It's not a one size fits all, but there are a lot of common elements that you would want to include on your team. So that's going to include property owners, developers, investors, those who may have the ability to help, make this dream a reality. Potential buyers, tenants, you want to consider them, who may be the end users, stakeholders. You want to make sure that these folks are included in the conversation, because that includes local and regional government, community groups, and nonprofits. You want to understand what they may be looking for, what seems to be desired, and what's feasible. And so that's from the public sector. And when you look privately, that could include lenders, insurers, and investors. Some other members for your team that you definitely need to consider, not even consider, include, is the EPA, because they have a lot of resources, including grants that you can take advantage of. TAB, you can always give us a call, as Carrie mentioned earlier, for all the reasons that we mentioned that we can provide assistance. And again, that's all free. A qualified environmental professional. So those are the ones who are going to do the boots on the ground assessment work and cleanup work. So you need to have one that you feel comfortable with. And then also your state environmental agencies. We here in Region 3 have great state agencies, and you absolutely need to get involved with them. And we can always help make connections to any of these partners. And again, that's just another way we can help. So for the redevelopment process, you're going to start with identifying the site or sites. A way you can do that is through an inventory process, because some sites may seem intuitive. Oh wow, that's really a bad looking site. It was once an industrial site, but sometimes there's properties or buildings that you just may not have thought of, including some that may only have asbestos or lead-based paint because of the time it was built, and it may not seem as intuitive, but as Carrie said, it's probably a brownfield, and you only need to suspect that it was in order to start the process. So the site assessment, and so that consists of a phase 1 assessment, which is handled by your QEP. And the phase 1 is largely desk work. So it involves research, looking at the history, actually going out to take some photos of the site and kind of looking around the property to determine if there may be some areas of concern. And then phase 2 would actually be if, after conducting that phase 1, you have found some potential contaminants and where you believe they may be. Then phase 2 is where you start to mobilize and actually take samples, which would ultimately need to be cleaned up. So after assessment work has been done and you have an idea of the extent and the type of contaminants on site, then you can start to look at the site planning and reuse. Starting to identify, just how big is this area in question? What is a feasible way to be able to move forward? And so that's a really important piece. You can also always be considering that, before you, at the beginning there with site identification, because you may have some sites that are clustered together. So it may be one large site, or it could be smaller properties that ultimately, if you have the lens of looking at site planning and what would be the end use, can you start to combine those properties and look for your reuse plan. So again, it's not really set in stone for that. So you can keep that in mind. Project financing. So if you're looking for financial assistance and how to make this happen, EPA funding is available, but it only takes you so far. So you need to have a sense of where additional funds can come from in order to actually bring your project to fruition. When it comes to actually conducting a phase one assessment, as we like to tell folks, there is nearly always some funding available that we can try to help you locate to pay for that phase one. A lot of folks have an assessment grant it may be a community-wide assessment grant. Your state environmental agency may have one. Sometimes you can tap into that so that could pay for the phase one, and that would give you a good start so you're ready to move on to phase two. So, that's a good start. The EPA has their grants. They also have technical assistance that's available. So, but again, that is for starting process, and you need to look also for other sources of funding that can help make that happen. Is that economic development, HUD? Just look at all the sources that may help actually, again, bring that project to life. And then ultimately redevelopment, just as we saw on the previous slide that showed some examples of the end use. So, and where do you start? So when it comes to the actual details of the property, the details of the property, in order to assess it and clean it up, you have to have permission to access the property. Don't do anything sketchy like driving in without permission. That's never anything that's okay. So it's actually part of the process that you have to have an access agreement. So, and that is even to go on the property to, again, take the photos for the phase one assessment. So make sure you have that. When it comes to the actual assessment, if you have an assessment grant or you're looking to take on an assessment grant, you don't need to own it. If you are the one that holds the grant and you've identified the properties that you want to be able to assess, as long as you have their permission, the property owner's permission to actually conduct that assessment, that's all you need. You don't need to have the intention to own it in that situation. And then if you are going to look to actually clean up the property, and one of the things you're hoping to achieve is an EPA cleanup grant, you do need to determine how you would go about acquiring the property. Also, you need to think about community engagement. So you need to, again, as I mentioned earlier, prepare Brownfields inventory. So that helps with the site identification. How many sites are you looking at in a neighborhood or in your entire city? That helps you be able to plan and prioritize where you should be starting first. And what's the community vision for the property or area? It doesn't do you any good to have your own personal vision for how to redevelop an area if you don't involve the community, because they are the ones who are there. It's their community. They see it every day. They have ideas for what can help improve a community, and it's so important. It's actually not even negotiable that you need to include the community, because that's what's going to give you the strength and momentum, and it's also going to give you some project champions to help carry the project through. And also you want to identify the property or the area needs and assets. So again, what is it lacking? What do you need to improve? So you may be talking about infrastructure. You may have infrastructure that's already there to some extent, but maybe if it's water and sewer, there's not enough capacity and you need to look to expand that. Or maybe you don't have, maybe gas service became available and it's not yet extended to that site. So that's an example of some of the things you need to start to identify what you may need to actually improve upon. All right, so I touched on a bit already about the environmental assessment and cleanup. Again, it starts with the phase one, because that tells you what the potential environmental concerns could be on the property. And sometimes it's, not sometimes, when they are conducting, when your QEP is conducting your phase one, they're also looking at the adjacent uses. So if there's an adjacent gas station, like Carrie was talking about, your property in question may not have actually had the tanks, but it may have received a lot of that's been draining onto the property over the years. So that's why, again, they kind of step back and look at the look at the history of the site and adjacent sites. So, you know, it's a good comprehensive review of the history of the property. And phase two is actually determining what contaminants are on the property, and to a large extent, just how extensive is that contamination, so that can help set you up for a cleanup grant if that's what you want to apply for. And cleanup is actually taking that information from the phase one and ultimately the phase two, and being able to clean that up again, also with a qualified consultant who has the ability to take that on. We really like to flag this for you, and Seth did a good job of flagging this in this presentation, because we always like to let you know, whatever you do, do not acquire a property without having conducted a phase one site assessment, which is also known as the all appropriate inquiry. That is what gives you some liability protection should you end up taking ownership of the property. And this means whether you take ownership and it was $1 or it was at the market rate. So it doesn't matter if it was a discount property. Ultimately, a liability could be far more expensive than that discount bargain that you acquired the property for. But you don't want to take ownership of the property before having conducted the phase one, because that would keep you from being eligible to apply for an EPA cleanup grant, because you could be considered the liable party even though you didn't do that. And you know, that may seem very obvious that you, again, as the new owner, are not the one who was responsible for the pollution, but that not having conducted the phase one assessment, or again the AAI, will absolutely, unfortunately, keep you from being able to apply for a cleanup grant. And as I stated earlier, don't let a phase one assessment deter you. Please contact us or your state environmental agency. We can most likely find funding to help make that happen. So just give us a call. We'd be happy to help. Carrie, if you ever have anything to jump in on.
I just wanted, there's a question in the chat that I think we could do now, and I want to invite Jan to ask it aloud so that maybe we can get some more detail. But while you find your mute button, Jan, she says, what is the impact of a current use of the property, assuming that the current use is not legal, for example, a homeless encampment? Can you just tell us a little bit more?
Yes, we have a approximately 18-acre brownfield that is owned half by Baltimore City, half by the state of Maryland. It has been a large, meaning large, like 50 to 75 individuals, encampment for homeless people. They have, some of them have built structures on it. And obviously we need to clean it up. Obviously people should not live on a brownfield, but you know, somehow it seems kind of wrong just to go and say, okay, you guys move now, because we're going to be digging up the dirt. So how, is there any sort of plan for coordinating, you know, services or whatever for people living on the brownfield, or other problems? I mean, I'm sure other people have these uses on their properties that they would like to know, hey, how do we do this?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that you're being thoughtful about it preemptively, because that's not always what happens, right? That those people would just be displaced. And so I think EPA, I don't have a quick answer for you. I think it would have to be, Katie can jump into, and others on the call, if you've dealt with this and you have thoughts or seen other people deal with it. I think that looking to peers is helpful in situations like this and how it's been, but I do think that coordination with other agencies that are not thinking about brownfields, that are serving unhoused individuals, and making sure that it's done in a thoughtful way. I think we've all seen examples of it done in a not thoughtful way. But making sure that they do have a place to go makes a lot of sense. But you're right. I mean, it's not safe where they are for a number of reasons, and the brownfield piece only adds to that. I think I can think of another example where there was a site that was just appeared to be a vacant lot to the path, right? If you didn't know the history of the site, it's just a gravel lot. People were walking across it to access recreational opportunities that they probably weren't. Like, you're not getting a lot of risk just walking across it, but you shouldn't be. And it needed to be cleaned up. And so it was recommended to the property owner that they put a fence up, and it was a public property owner. They were concerned about the perception of, if we put a fence up, people are going to be worried that it's contaminated, but the reality is that it's contaminated already, whether you put a fence up or not. So I think the other piece is about the messaging, right? And messaging and remembering that unhoused population is one of your stakeholders. So how do you message directly to them about why this is happening and how and what, and again, the connection to those resources. I have a lot of passion and feeling as a citizen of the world about making sure we handle that correctly. I don't have any professional expertise about that, those kinds of services, but Katie, what would you add?
I think that that's well said, and our mission here at TAB is always to, even if we don't know the answer or we are not the answer for someone or for you, we'd like to be able to try our best to help hand you off to someone who could be helpful. So if you want to follow up with us, and we can try to do a little bit of brainstorming, we can't make any promises, but we're always happy to help, because you're probably not going to be the last time we get such a question. So it's only helpful for us. So
If I could also kind of add on to that, because our brownfield is owned half by Baltimore City and half by the state, is there any strategy? Our nonprofit could, I don't know, take title. We don't want to. Would that solve the problem? How do we get the city and the state on the same page? And by the way, the state has so far indicated a lot more interest in doing something, and the city has washed its hands.
Yeah, I think it would be great for us to chat, because this sounds like a really interesting project and we would love to help however we can. I think we can have a more detailed conversation about it um as a follow-up. I think that would be really great.
Jan, could I send you a follow-up email?
Absolutely. I'll
Okay,
put I'm sure you have my email somewhere,
Yeah.
but if you want me to match it up, I can certainly put it in the chat.
great.
Great.
Thank you so much.
I will add one more thing, and I'll do some research in the meantime. But EPA has been talking a lot more in the brownfield space about displacement in redevelopment. They're primarily thinking about traditional gentrification, but I don't think you're the only people who are dealing with this specific problem or concern. And I think that I will just reach out to our peers at EPA and at our other technical assistance providers to see if anybody else has any other good resources.
Okay.
So.
That would be great. And then maybe we can set up a time to have a conversation and throw some things along, because there is a state, I don't know whether they're agency, nonprofit, whatever, who's been very interested and really helped and has applied, in fact, for funding.
Oh, great.
To look into some of this stuff. So I would like to include them in our conversation as well, if we can.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jan. I spoke a lot about the elements in this slide previously, but again, this slide tells you why it's so important to conduct that phase 1 or AAI. Again, it gives you liability protection because when you purchase, again, a property without having conducted that, you could be considered the potentially responsible party, and you could be held liable for contaminants. Again, it would make you ineligible for EPA cleanup funding. And also, by conducting that phase 1, it lets you know what the potential contaminants are. So there would be fewer surprises. Sometimes, there still may be an element of surprise after you've conducted a phase 1, but at least it gives you an awareness, and especially if you didn't suspect much of anything before looking into a property. So it really is a good, thoughtful step, regardless of if you need EPA cleanup funding. So what funding is available? Well, there are EPA grants. We affectionately call them MARC grants. So that's multi-purpose assessment, cleanup, revolving loan fund, and job training grants. Job training isn't part of MARC, but so these are the big ones offered through the EPA. The multi-purpose assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan are set up so that those RFPs are released in the fall of the year and then come due right around November. And job training is, I think, generally May, I believe, is when, I can't remember if that's when it's released or due, Carrie.
Maybe August.
There you go. So released in May.
Let's say summer.
So, you know, these are really great. We offer webinars as well to help educate you on what is available with the various types. Multipurpose is the combination of assessment and cleanup, so it allows you to take that on. It is a more complex grant, so it wouldn't be a great one to start with if you have not yet applied for EPA Brownfield grant. An assessment would probably be your better bet, but still also, you know, make sure you bring in a team to help you through that process and navigate that, because again, lots of free resources for that. And then, yeah, so again, happy to talk more about that. Then there's EPA technical assistance, the targeted brownfield assessment, not to be confused with TAB, TAV. So that's available funding through your regional EPA provider. And so that's really good because it allows you to look at usually if you just have one site in mind and you know, you don't have the capacity or just don't have many sites that you want to take on, the TBA is really good because you are actually working with the EPA and their contractor actually takes on the assessment work. So it's a really great opportunity to give you and the EPA exposure to one another, but you don't have to be the one that does the heavy lifting. And so it also gives you a good jump start if later down the road you want to be able to apply for an actual EPA brownfield grant. There's also the regionally directed and land revitalization technical assistance and the Repowering America's Land Initiative. So I won't go into detail on that, but those are some other EPA technical assistance. Some other sources of funding, again, as I touched on earlier, why additional funding matters. You could look at historic low-income housing funding, and then new market and state-specific tax credits. So again, how are you going to take this brownfield site to a thriving, much better end use? You got to start to put these things together. Tax credits can be one way to do so. Loans, including traditional lending, and we like to point out that there are others who have some social impact component to them. So those are some examples you might explore. Private investments, and then there are so many other sources as well. Federal sources that you have, CDBG, USDA, and then for those of us, because we are in the Appalachian Regional area, it's the Appalachian Regional Commission. So many more. There's a lot more we could say about that. Happy to talk more about that, and we'll give you more details later, but we actually have a webinar coming up later in February that talks about some resources that Brownsville, Pennsylvania has used. And finally, as we start to wrap up, we want to just leave you with some key terms. We hope that this PowerPoint presentation will be helpful for you as a takeaway. And so we've thrown around a lot of acronyms. We talk about that a lot where as we're starting out, we kind of have to have our own dictionary. So we hope this is helpful, just kind of gives you a little more detail on some of the topics we talked about: redevelopment, phase one, qualified environmental professional. So keep that handy for you. And at this time, we'll take any questions. Again, ask them in the chat or feel free to come off mute and ask them. We're happy to answer.
All right, Katie. We had another question in the chat from John. Are there constraints for the grants in terms of what the property is intended to be reused for?
There are not, for EPA grants, there are not constraints based on what it's going to be used for. They do like a good story, so story is really important. The eligibility constraints around the site have to do with your ownership eligibility. So all of that phase one stuff that Katie talked about, only certain entities are eligible for funding, and the entity that's applying does have to own the property that would be cleaned up. But as far as reuse goes, in order to apply for a cleanup grant successfully, you need to have a clear vision for your site, but there does not have to be a specific kind of vision. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Also from the chat, Stephen asked if we know about grants that are specifically to address blight.
Stephen, can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure, thank you. Well, I've heard that some of the US EPA grants can be used to address blight, because even, you take like a really old home or maybe a block of them, and they could certainly have things like PCB caulk, asbestos, maybe there's some underground storage tanks, who knows, in a block. So, somebody, a community that is looking to maybe, and maybe some of these properties are in tax delinquency. So a land bank might be looking to acquire them. So that's kind of the scenario.
Yeah. So I think, Katie, jump in, but I think the short answer is yes, you could. There's a number of ways that you could use EPA money for a scenario like that. Certainly, any of those properties could be assessed. In the instance of tax delinquency, the tax status doesn't matter. Often in tax delinquency, the property owner is difficult to get in touch with, and you do still have to have site access. But as long as you have a site agreement to allow you to get on a property, you could do assessments. Cleanup grants can be used. Would be surprised if nobody has tried what you're talking about. I don't have in my Rolodex brain an example off the top of my head, but they can be used for a scenario that you're talking about. You can use a cleanup grant for one cleanup grant for multiple properties. You do have to own every every property that you're gonna clean up with a cleanup grant. That's a non-negotiable requirement. So it would be possible, and you're absolutely right. There are a number of things. EPA will not pay for demolition. They will pay for removal of things like asbestos, which sometimes can only be removed as part of demolition. So it can still help to offset some of those costs, but you couldn't use it just to demolish sort of a blighted area. And you have to be very careful about if there's demolition, confirming that you're only using EPA funds for the things that they want to pay for. But yes. And then the other thing I would say is that there's a number of planning activities that you can do with any kind of EPA grant, with the assessment grant, the multipurpose grant, and the cleanup grant. And you could do a number of plans around sort of reuse of a blighted area.
Would you say that it's more effective when you have, a bunch of these properties maybe all lined up versus, one property on the 300 block of Main Street, another property on the 200 block of Second Street, and all because, so.
Yeah. I think it's easier as a my background is grant writing and fundraising. As a grant writer, I think it's easier to tell a story if it's a cohesive sort of like neighborhood, right? In the very small 10 pages that you get. I also think that the impact, right? If you're able to do like a big concentrated, like a deal with concentrated blight versus a few scattered properties, obviously then the impact is a lot better. There is a bigger potential for some of that displacement that we talked about before. But there are ways to mitigate that for sure. But yeah, that would be my off the cuff answer. There is when you talked about land banks, there is a new resource from EPA. There's a new technical assistance provider specifically looking at brownfields and land banks. It's the Center for Creative Progress. Sorry, I blanked on their name for a minute. Center for Community Progress. They have a long history and are experts on blight and land banking. But the initial bit of their grant will be to do some research on how land banks are working in brownfields, and then they will have some services specific to brownfields probably in the next year or so. But in the meantime, we can definitely help with some of that as well. And we can always pull them in as we need to.
Did you say that there's a guidance document on it, or they're working
on the guidance document, I believe.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Melissa has her hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Melissa.
So my question is very specific, and I'm not sure if it would apply, and if we need to talk offline, that's great. I live in the town of Thurmond. I don't know if there are people on here that have heard that the Park Service is planning on destroying historical structures. I don't own the property, the federal government does. I'm looking for ways to propose to them alternative options. Is a brownfield grant a possibility as an option for me to apply for the grant to do the assessment work? Or have the assessment work done? And then possibly use that to get additional grants? Does that make sense?
Thurman's Fayette County, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we should talk offline. Fayette County has a grant already, an assessment grant. I don't know, like it's possible that that could be used. I mean, the biggest thing will be cooperation from the Park Service on anything that you said. And then
Correct.
the other thing I'm just not sure about is I've never encountered a request to assess federally owned property. So I just would want to clarify that that's eligible. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not. I just don't want to tell you for sure that it is without knowing for sure.
Understood.
It's just not a scenario I've seen before. The other people to talk to might be, is Danielle at Preservation Alliance? Do you know those guys?
We have been trying to communicate.
Okay. Yeah, let's follow up offline.
Thank you.
I have been seeing that in the news. Okay, I'm letting you have the next one. I'm gonna shut up.
Great questions, everyone. If you have any questions you think about after this, you'll have our contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out. I think we have a poll to run, Becca, just quickly before we just run into our final slide.
We do, thank you.
Thank you.
So, we are grant funded as the tab provider, so we have a poll for you all to take to just kind of measure learning from the webinar. So if you could take that question real quick. And Katie, I'll let you go on to the next one while people are finishing up.
Thank you. This is again a repeat of the slide earlier, just a reminder of how we can help. And again, we are in EPA Region 3, so it's West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and DC. We're happy to help in any way. If there is a topic that you believe would be helpful as a webinar, we're happy to do that. If you and your community would like some information, we're always happy to go in person and do that. We like to be able to do some brownfield basics. We collaborated a bit with that in Pennsylvania. They hosted brownfield basics throughout the state of Pennsylvania at 3 different locations, and we tag teamed and did a bit of a presentation. Hopefully it was, beneficial to those who attended, but, we're happy to do anything like that. Again, help you with conducting that inventory to help identify where are those sites so you can start to think about, what is the end goal. Again, we can help you with reviewing grants. If you have a draft, we're happy to take a look at them. We always encourage you to start earlier. You will hear us say, take a look at the previous grant application. Go ahead and get started in that so you can start to think about that, because not much changes from year to year, and we will always highlight what the changes are from year to year. So it's always a good idea to start doing that ahead of time. And yeah, there's just so many other ways that we can help you. So don't hesitate to reach out. And we do want to let you know, feel free to register. We're very excited about this webinar. It's kind of nerdy to me to be excited about this, but I hope you'll share in this. We're pretty excited. It's going to be kind of a game show format. So the folks in Brownsville, Pennsylvania are willing participants. And so it's going to be, again, kind of a fun way to learn about just how they've been able to put together some resources for their downtown and the surrounding area. And we hope you will be able to join us and learn more from, some of your constituents and get some inspiration. And so again, feel free to register there. We'd love to have you. Carrie?
Yeah, I just would say if we, so we are again the technical assistance provider for Region 3. If we have any interlopers from other parts of the country, there are technical assistance providers for every state and territory, as well as the federally recognized tribes. So we are happy to have you here. Webinars are a fun place to see all of our friends. But we are also happy to help you connect with your technical assistance provider in your region. If you're not sure who that is, you can always reach out to us and we'll make that connection.